world changed while America wasn't paying attention. Now, as we watch the pageantry of military parades in Beijing and the chest-thumping rhetoric from Washington, we're witnessing something far more profound than most people realize. We're watching the final act of American economic dominance, and the curtain is falling faster than anyone in power wants to admit. Let me paint you a picture of what's really happening behind the headlines and the bluster. When you see those missiles rolling down the avenues of Beijing, that's theater. When you hear American politicians threatening tariffs and sanctions, that's desperation dressed up as strength. The real story is being written in factories, shipping lanes, and central bank vaults across the globe. And it's a story that should terrify anyone who believes America can bully its way back to unchallenged supremacy. China is now the manufacturing center of the world, not just the manufacturing center, but the center, while America spent decades financializing its economy, moving production overseas, and turning once mighty industrial cities into what we now call the Rust Belt. China was building something unprecedented in human history. They created a manufacturing engine so powerful, so efficient, and so technologically advanced that they can produce virtually anything with speed and quality that often surpasses what the West can deliver. Think about what this means in practical terms. When America needed ventilators during the pandemic, where did we turn? When Europe needed solar panels for their green energy transition, who supplied them? When the global semiconductor shortage threatened to shut down automotive production worldwide, which country ramped up chip manufacturing fastest? The answer is always the same: China. Not because they're cheap labor anymore, but because they've become the most capable producers on Earth. This manufacturing dominance isn't just about making things. It's about power, real power, the kind that matters when push comes to shove and nations need to sustain themselves through conflict. And we learned this lesson the hard way through our proxy war in Ukraine, though most Americans still haven't grasped what that lesson actually teaches us. Remember the confidence with which President Biden announced the mother of all sanctions against Russia? Remember the catchy phrases about turning the ruble into rubble? Remember the absolute certainty that we would bring Putin to his knees through economic warfare? Well, here's what actually happened and why it should keep every American strategist awake at night. Russia, faced with the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history, didn't collapse. They didn't even stumble significantly. Instead, they demonstrated something that fundamentally alters the global balance of power. They showed that America's primary weapon, economic coercion through the dollar-dominated financial system, is no longer the decisive force it once was. How did they do it? Through BRICS. When Europe, under American pressure, stopped buying Russian oil and gas, Russia simply redirected those energy exports to China and India. These two massive economies, representing nearly 3 billion people, absorbed Russia's energy output at good prices, paid in their own currencies, or through barter arrangements that bypassed the dollar entirely. The sanctions that were supposed to cripple Russia's economy instead accelerated the creation of alternative economic systems that don't depend on American approval. The results speak for themselves, though you won't hear this on most American news channels. Over the 3 years of war in Ukraine, Russia's economy has grown faster than the American economy. Let that sink in. A country under the heaviest sanctions in history, fighting an expensive war, has outperformed the United States economically. This isn't just embarrassing. It's a fundamental game changer that reveals the limits of American power in ways that should alarm anyone who understands geopolitics. But the implications go deeper than economics. Russia's ability to sustain this war effort while growing its economy demonstrates something terrifying for American military planners. Russia has essentially unlimited access to the weapons and materials it needs because China and other BRICS nations are willing and able to supply them, while America and Europe struggle to ramp up ammunition production, while our defense contractors operate on peacetime schedules with peacetime profit margins. Russia has access to the world's largest manufacturing base, operating at wartime efficiency. This is what happens when you realize you're living in a cartoon where Wile E. Coyote has run off the cliff but hasn't looked down yet. American leaders keep making threats based on an economic dominance that no longer exists, wielding weapons that no longer work, and expecting compliance from nations that have already found alternatives to the systems that once made American power irresistible. The BRICS nations aren't just creating alternative trade arrangements, they're building a parallel global system that increasingly makes American approval irrelevant. When Indonesia, a country of 275 million people, joins BRICS, that's not just another country switching sides. That's a massive market, a huge population, and enormous natural resources deciding they don't need to organize their economic future around American preferences. And this brings us to the most dangerous realization of all. The leaders in Beijing, Moscow, New Delhi, and other BRICS capitals aren't treating Trump as an aberration anymore. They're not waiting for American politics to return to some imagined normal state where reasonable people make reasonable deals. They've concluded, based on observing American political discourse, that hostility toward the rising powers is now bipartisan American consensus. This changes everything. When other nations believe that American aggression is permanent policy rather than temporary political theater, they stop trying to manage the relationship and start building systems that make the relationship irrelevant. They stop holding dollars as reserves. They stop pricing their commodities in dollars. They stop routing their trade through American-controlled financial networks. They start creating their own systems. And once those systems reach critical mass, American economic power becomes largely theoretical. Look at what's happening in real time. The United States just destroyed a Venezuelan vessel, claiming God knows what justification. Trump promised to end the wars in Ukraine and Gaza within days of taking office. Instead, he's already attacking Iran and apparently eyeing Venezuela for military action. This isn't strength. This is a desperate empire lashing out as its influence wanes, creating more enemies at exactly the moment when it can least afford them. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is doing something that should terrify American policymakers. They're protecting themselves by reducing their dependence on America. They don't want to rely on American markets for their exports because Trump or someone like him might cut them off with a tweet. They don't want to buy American imports because trade relationships that took decades to build can apparently be destroyed overnight for political theater. They don't want to keep their reserves in Western banks because what happened to Russia's $300 billion, 0 cents in frozen assets, could happen to anyone who falls out of favor with Washington. We're becoming what used to be called a rogue nation, a country so unpredictable, so prone to sudden aggressive actions, so unreliable in its commitments, that other nations actively work to minimize their exposure to our decisions. When you walk down the street and someone approaches you, talking loudly to themselves, making aggressive gestures, and showing signs of instability, what do? You back away. You find an alternative route, and you protect yourself from their unpredictability. That's what the world is doing to America. The irony would be funny if it weren't so tragic. The headlines from Beijing this past weekend represent a milestone in the global isolation of the United States. While American media focuses on the spectacle of military hardware rolling through Chinese streets, the real story is the dozens of nations sending high-level delegations to participate in forums that explicitly exclude American participation. These aren't just ceremonial meetings. These are working sessions where the future architecture of global trade, finance, and governance is being negotiated without American input. Even European allies are beginning to distance themselves from American positions. France and Britain have announced they're ending weapons shipments to Israel and won't support continued military operations in Gaza. Whether they follow through completely remains to be seen, but the mere fact that they're willing to make such statements publicly represents a significant shift. America increasingly stands alone in supporting policies that the rest of the world considers genocidal. At the United Nations, the pattern is unmistakable. On major controversial issues like Ukraine and Gaza, most countries now vote with China rather than the United States. America finds itself isolated with a handful of allies, while the vast majority of the world's nations oppose to American interests. These aren't just symbolic votes. They represent shifting power relationships that will influence everything from trade agreements to military cooperation to international law for decades to come. The developing world provides perhaps the clearest example of how fundamentally the global landscape has changed. African nations desperate to escape centuries of poverty and underdevelopment used to follow a predictable pattern when seeking investment and development assistance. They would send delegations to Washington, London, and New York, hat in hand, hoping to secure whatever crumbs the Western powers were willing to offer. That's not how it works anymore. Today, African delegations still visit Western capitals, but they don't go home with whatever they can get. Instead, they fly directly to Beijing, New Delhi, or Sao Paulo, and make the same pitch again. They tell potential partners directly that they're shopping for the best deal, and whoever can offer more gets the contract. This is capitalism, working exactly as it's supposed to, but it's devastating for American influence because American companies and government agencies are no longer automatically the best option available. Travel through Africa today and you'll see the results. Chinese companies are building railroads, hospitals, universities, and power plants. Indian firms are providing telecommunications infrastructure and pharmaceutical manufacturing. Brazilian agricultural companies are sharing expertise and providing equipment. The infrastructure that will define Africa's economic future for the next century is being built by BRICS nations, not Western powers, because they offer better terms, faster timelines, and fewer political conditions This represents a historical transformation as significant as the end of colonialism itself. For the first time in 5 centuries, the developing world has genuine alternatives to Western economic models and Western political conditions. They can choose partners based on practical benefits rather than having to accept whatever terms the formerly dominant powers are willing to offer. The dollar's declining role in this new world order reflects these deeper shifts in economic power. 30 years ago, central banks around the world held 70 to 80% of their reserves in dollars. Today, that figure has dropped to 40 to 50%. The dollar remains the single most important international currency, but it's not what it once was, and the trend is clear and accelerated. Inside BRICS, there are intense debates about how to manage this transition away from dollar dominance. Some members want to replace the dollar with the Chinese yuan, essentially transferring global monetary leadership from one empire to another. Others prefer creating an entirely new currency backed by a basket of BRICS nations' economies, offering the world an alternative that isn't dominated by any single country. Still others argue for a more cautious approach, recognizing that the dollar-dominated system, despite its problems, provided the framework within which BRICS nations developed their current economic strength. They worry about killing the goose that laid the golden eggs, preferring gradual reform to revolutionary change. These debates aren't happening in secret. They're conducted openly in academic conferences, government publications, and international forums. If American policymakers were less focused on dismissing BRICS as irrelevant and more interested in understanding what they're actually doing, these discussions would be general knowledge in Washington. Instead, we live in a bubble where we can still pretend that American preferences automatically determine global outcomes. The tragedy is that the United States could still influence these debates if we approach them with wisdom rather than belligerence. If America proposed an international conference on monetary reform, if we suggested working together to create a more stable and equitable global financial system, BRICS nations would participate. They would send their best economists and negotiators because finding ways for the dollar to continue playing a role alongside new alternatives might create a more stable world than the current trajectory toward complete financial fragmentation. But this requires admitting that other nations have legitimate interests that deserve consideration. It requires abandoning the fantasy that America can simply impose its will on the rest of the world through threats and economic coercion. It requires recognizing that we're living through a historical transition, whether we like it or not. And our choice is whether to help manage that transition constructively or to be swept away by forces we refuse to acknowledge until they become unstoppable. I believe there's hope in the emerging generation of American leaders who didn't spend their entire lives under Cold War thinking. The people who lead us now are products of a time when the world was divided into good guys and bad guys, when America was automatically righteous and our opponents were automatically evil. That worldview shaped universities, communities, and families for 3/4 of a century, and it's proving inadequate to address current realities. A new generation is coming up with different perspectives. They understand that America remains enormously powerful and influential, but they also recognize that this influence works best through cooperation rather than coercion. They see that our current leverage provides an opportunity to shape global systems while we still have significant bargaining power, rather than waiting until we're so marginalized that other nations can simply ignore our preferences. Consider the Ukrainian situation from this perspective. Russia, despite being at war, despite facing comprehensive sanctions, despite losing hundreds of soldiers daily, despite having their energy infrastructure regularly attacked, has managed not just to survive, but to grow economically. They've done this because they have powerful allies who provide them with alternatives to Western systems. Meanwhile, America fights this proxy war without any American casualties, without attacks on American infrastructure, without any direct threats to American territory. We have enormous advantages that we could leverage for diplomatic solutions if we chose cooperation over confrontation, but instead we seem determined to continue policies that have already failed to achieve their stated objectives while creating new enemies and driving more nations into alternative alliances. The same pattern appears in our approach to China. We have massive economic relationships, extensive academic exchanges, millions of people on both sides who benefit from cooperation. But rather than building on these connections to manage our differences constructively, we seem determined to treat every disagreement as an existential threat, requiring military posturing and economic warfare. Young Americans increasingly understand that this approach serves no one's interests, except those who profit from conflict and arms races. They want leaders who can sit down with Chinese and Russian counterparts to work out arrangements that serve everyone's long-term interests, rather than seeking zero-sum victories that are increasingly impossible to achieve. Anyway, this brings us to the domestic dimension of these global changes, because America's international decline reflects deeper problems in our economic system. We are living through the dying of an empire. And these are exactly the kinds of symptoms that appear when empires enter terminal decline: extreme inequality, political polarization, infrastructure decay, social fragmentation, and leaders who mistake bluster for strength. Trump's recently passed tax legislation provides a perfect example of how this system operates. The tax cuts for corporations and wealthy individuals are permanent and substantial. The token benefits for working people are temporary, limited, and designed primarily to provide political cover for massive wealth transfers to those who need them least. Take the provision about tax-free tip income. Sounds good in a campaign speech, but the actual legislation caps this benefit at $25,000, 0 cents per year. Most workers in tip-based jobs already earn close to that limit, so the practical benefit is minimal. Meanwhile, there are no caps on the benefits flowing to corporations and high-income individuals. This isn't policy designed to help working people. It's theater designed to disguise policies that help only the wealthy. This happened at the end of a 40-year period during which every serious economic study shows massive wealth redistribution from bottom and middle to top. Every economist who studies inequality agrees that we've experienced unprecedented concentration of wealth and income. Never did corporations and the wealthy need tax cuts less than when they got the biggest tax cuts in generations in 2017. The business community wasn't horrified by Trump's racism, his scapegoating of immigrants, or his authoritarian tendencies. They brought him back because he delivered exactly what they wanted: permanent tax cuts that accelerate wealth concentration while providing political theater to distract public attention from economic reality. Now, he's delivered again. The 2017 tax cuts scheduled to expire this year have been extended and enhanced. The job he was sent to Washington to accomplish is complete. Everything else is entertainment. All the dramatic announcements, the inflammatory tweets, the international incidents, the cultural controversies, these are sideshows designed to keep the public focused anywhere except on the systematic looting of the national wealth. The people who actually run this country, the major banks, hedge funds, and technology corporations, don't care what Trump does for the rest of his term. They got what they needed. If he goes too far and threatens their broader interests, they'll rein him in. If he becomes a liability, they'll find someone else. But the core mission has been accomplished. This is why Trump is already in deeper trouble than most people realize. Now that he's delivered the tax cuts, the financial elite are already looking past him toward the next presidential cycle. He served his purpose, and his usefulness is diminishing daily. The same forces that elevated him can abandon him just as quickly if he becomes more liability than asset. But the deeper problem isn't Trump. It's the system that produces Trumps. We've organized our society around the principle that a tiny elite should make all major economic decisions, while everyone else lives with the consequences. We eliminated monarchy in politics, but preserved it in economics. Instead of kings, we have CEOs who exercise the same kind of arbitrary power over people's lives. Think about your workplace. You have no say in major decisions that affect your daily life. Someone else decides whether you have a job, what you're paid, where you work, how you work, and whether your position continues to exist. You live under economic dictatorship while being told you live in a democracy. This contradiction creates the frustrations that make people susceptible to demagogues who promise simple solutions to complex problems. The alternative exists, but it requires recognizing that democracy can't survive when it's limited to political theater, while economic power remains completely unaccountable. We need workplace democracy. We need cooperative ownership structures where workers collectively own and manage their enterprises. We need one person, one vote principles applied to the places where we spend most of our waking hours. This isn't utopian thinking. Cooperative businesses exist throughout America and around the world. They demonstrate daily that production can be organized democratically, that profits can be shared equitably, that workers can make intelligent decisions about their economic futures when given the opportunity and information to do so. When workers own their businesses collectively, the profits that currently flow to distant shareholders instead flow to the people who actually create the value. When workers vote on major decisions, those decisions reflect the interests of people who live with the consequences rather than people who profit from exploitation. When communities have input into local economic development, they can prioritize human needs over abstract financial returns. This is how we build an economy that serves people instead of requiring people to serve capital. This is how we create the material basis for a political movement that can offer real alternatives to the choice between different varieties of elite rule. This is how we move beyond capitalism towards something that deserves to be called democracy. The internet gives us tools for communication and organization that previous generations of activists could only dream about. Social media allows us to coordinate across traditional boundaries of geography, race, class, and nationality. We can share information, plan actions, and build solidarity in ways that were impossible just decades ago. But communication alone isn't enough. We need to build actual economic alternatives that demonstrate superior ways of organizing production and distribution. We need to create institutions that can provide for people's material needs while operating according to democratic principles. We need to show that cooperation works better than competition, that democracy produces better outcomes than dictatorship, that solidarity creates more prosperity than selfishness. The cooperative movement provides the foundation for this transformation. Every worker-owned business that succeeds demonstrates the viability of democratic alternatives. Every cooperative that treats workers fairly shows that exploitation isn't necessary for productivity. Every democratically managed enterprise that thrives proves that ordinary people can make complex economic decisions when they have access to information and incentives to make decisions that serve collective interests. This is practical work that we can begin today. Wherever we are, whatever our circumstances, we can support existing cooperatives by choosing to buy from them when possible. We can advocate for public policies that make cooperative formation easier and more financially viable. We can educate ourselves and others about successful examples of workplace democracy. We can organize in our own workplaces for greater worker input into management decisions. Most importantly, we can stop waiting for politicians to save us and start building the economic foundation for the society we want to live in. Politicians will follow where organized economic power leads. If we want political leaders who serve human needs instead of corporate profits, we need to create economic institutions that demonstrate what serving human needs actually looks like in practice. The global transition away from American dominance is going to happen whether Americans like it or not. The question is whether we'll participate constructively in creating whatever comes next, or whether we'll exhaust ourselves in futile attempts to preserve arrangements that no longer serve anyone's interests except the tiny elite who profit from conflict and instability. The rest of the world is building alternatives to American-dominated systems because those systems have become extractive and exploitative rather than productive and beneficial. If America wants to remain relevant in the emerging global order, we need to offer something better than threats, sanctions, and military intervention. We need to demonstrate that we can contribute to solving shared human problems rather than creating new problems to serve narrow corporate interests. This requires acknowledging that other nations have legitimate interests that deserve respect. It requires abandoning the